Imagine the orange horizon turns black before your eyes as you cross the threshold of Earth's atmosphere into a vast chasm of darkness, the final frontier, space. Then it looms before you, the International Space Station. You take an oxygenated breath. As you take your first steps into this beautiful, intricate piece of machinery, you feel like this moment, this singular moment, is the greatest moment of your life. At least, that's what Dennis Tito thought. On April 30th, 2001, Dennis Tito became the first space tourist, the first person to use space for commercial purposes. But Dennis wasn't your usual astronaut. He was 60, a civilian, and more importantly, he had never undergone any training. Eventually, he was able to hitch a ride with the Russian Space Agency, and in total, this trip cost him $20 million. Now, can I see a show of hands? Who has $20 million to spend on a 10-day vacation? That's what I thought. But what if I told you that in the future, this price tag of $20 million could be reduced to something slightly more affordable? In fact, in the next decade, this $20 million could become $100,000. Let that sink in. From $20 million to $100,000 within the decade. Now, this is going to raise a few questions. Firstly, who would pay that sum of money to go to space? What are the benefits of going to space? And more importantly, who would even want to go to space? Well, I did. When I was 10 years old, me and my parents took our first flight to Korea from Thailand. While we were waiting for this plane to depart, they put on a generic nature documentary, and it was at this point that I fell in love with exploration and traveling. Needless to say, I took every opportunity I could to explore, from diving to hiking up the Thai northern mountains. But there was one terrain that I couldn't quite access, and that was space. So I did everything in my power to bring me closer to my dream. So I discovered and eventually went on to study at Marlborough College in the UK, where they had their Blackett Observatory, and it was here that I met like-minded professors who shared in my dream of a commercial space tourism market. Under the guidance of Charles Barkley, Jonathan Genton, and Gavin James, we embarked on extraordinary research, and the culmination of our efforts ended in a paper titled The Genesis of Space Tourism. But the more I delved into this topic, the more I realized that despite my astronomy successes in the UK, all factors pointed to the States as the front runner in this increasingly benevolent space tourism industry, which led me here, to the US, where I'm currently studying astronomy and economics. Now, for any of you who love the New York Times connections just as much as I do, here's one for you. Chicha and Nimitpornsuko and the space tourism industry. What do we have in common? Well, our stories both begin with the aviation industry. On New Year's Day in 1914, the first commercial flight takes off from St. Petersburg, Florida, flying to Tampa. It's a 23-minute flight, and yet it costs the equivalent of $100,000 in today's currency. Now, for context, the most expensive flight in the world is $44,000, round trip in first class. Driven by an increased consumer interest, aviation providers were pushed to reduce costs by diversifying their products in a process known as economies of scale. It was this process that led to the aviation industry becoming so affordable. And if we look at our space tourism industry, we can see the same thing happening here. In 2003, the European Space Agency released what they called the Space Tourism Roadmap, the diagram behind me. It highlights 4 main stages. The first is short suborbital trips. The second is slightly longer orbital trips in a reusable spacecraft. The third is space hotels, and finally, we have tourism on the Moon and Mars. This first stage kicked off in 2008, and since then, there's only been increased demand. In fact, data from the UN WTO has stated that there is a very strong potential for this market. In 2012, the whole industry was worth only $1 billion of the US tourism industry, but in the future could contribute to up to 5% of the global tourism industry. Interested in contributing to this 5%? Great, let's see who our vendors are and what offers they have for us. First up is Blue Origin, run by Amazon entrepreneur Jeff Bezos. Jeff is currently planning to offer you 12-minute rides to the Kármán line, a recognized boundary between Earth and space. Leaked sources have placed this price to be between $200,000 and $300,000, pretty low compared to the first price he set of $28 billion. But what if you wanted to gaze into space for a little longer than 12 minutes? Then Virgin Galactic's got you. Run by eccentric billionaire Sir Richard Branson, Virgin Galactic are planning to offer you 90-minute rides in the hybrid spacecraft known as the Spaceship Two for $250,000. And you wouldn't be going alone. So far, 600 people have offered to come on this trip with you. I'd say that's a pretty good deal. But what about a little longer? Then, next up is the one and only Elon Musk's SpaceX. Elon has even gone so far as to quote a 10-day trip to the International Space Station for $55 million. But what about something a little more fun? Then Space Perspective are offering you 6-hour balloon rides into space. Yeah, you heard me, a balloon ride. Not only is it $125,000, it also features a toilet, 360-degree windows, and of course, a bar. There was even talks of there being a world luxury space hotel. They plan to offer trips into space, support zero-gravity research, and even space manufacturing. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the future of space exploration. Then this leads me on to, what's in it for us? Or more importantly, what is in it for you? There's been scientific research that shows that there are actually benefits of going to space. In a paper by Professors Yaden and Early of the University of Pennsylvania, they quoted something called an overview effect. This refers to a cognitive shift in behavior that makes us appreciate nature more and offers us a sense of coexistence with all humanity. This is supposed to have complex neurological benefits that range from improving cardiovascular health to facilitating group collaboration and even to enhancing creativity. Many astronauts who have returned from space also describe this as a wake-up call for them to come back and raise awareness for climate-related issues like global warming. With these out-of-the-world benefits, who could turn down a trip into space? But space is not just a dream for individuals. Without the interests of space agencies and nations, we would both be literally and figuratively lost. Everything from distinct GPS platforms to the internet is a distinct reminder that our future lies up there with space-related technologies like satellites. Speaking of space-related technologies, thanks to the interest in space, there's also been an increase in funding in technologies like satellites. As a Thai citizen, I have just had the pleasure of visiting the birthplace of the Theos 2 satellite at JISDA, the Thai Space Agency. Here is where I saw the interdisciplinary adaptations of space. This Theos satellite is on a geospatial mission to monitor agriculture and human resource development, but is currently also being used for architectural planning as well. This shows us that space doesn't always have to just be about rockets, research, or defense. Additionally, the incorporation of space into similar industries is actually very transferable. For example, most of the manufacturers who worked on the Theos 2 satellites were actually car manufacturers. To describe space accessibility, let us take our friend Steve. He's a hypothetical friend, by the way, in case any of you were wondering when I'd mentioned Steve before. Steve is on holiday, and he decides that he wants to go fishing in a harbor with hundreds of people who have the exact same idea as him. Now, you wouldn't expect him to catch that many fish, right? So what would he have to do to catch more fish? Perhaps move to a quieter spot? This would mean that he'd have to move away from the well-explored shallow waters into deeper, more mysterious waters. This wraps up the space tourism industry pretty well. Same harbor, that is tourism, just slightly deeper waters. Now, because not many people have even thought about exploring these waters, there really aren't that many companies who would provide the right tools. This means that whatever prices these companies charge, Steve would have to buy them. But on the flip side, Steve could potentially make more money by selling the more exotic fish. This wraps up space accessibility and the space tourism market pretty well. We have a market which is essentially our harbor. We have each individual fishing as companies who are trying to provide a service, and each fish as consumers in need of the service. You wouldn't expect companies to be making that much money in a saturated market. But by shifting to an untapped market that is space tourism, companies have more opportunities to make money. I stand here today to break that mirage of space inaccessibility and tell you that space can be and is being made accessible to everyone. Because space is no longer just for the billionaires, the astronauts, or the space companies. This is our time and our era to explore. So I'm simply asking, on behalf of the engineers, the economists, the physicists, and maybe even your future children, talk about it. Spread the word. Talk about it with anyone who will listen. In an era where technology is rapidly dominating our lives, I believe that the most organic and perhaps the most meaningful way to have a conversation is face-to-face. Now, imagine. It's decades away in the future. You watch as the Earth revolves around your feet as you sip on a margarita. Aren't you glad that you bought that ticket into space? Thank you.